Hi, my name is Paul Nation and I've been training teachers of English as a foreign language for over 50 years. Today I'm going to talk about beginning to listen and beginning to speak. And I'll show you some things that you can focus on when learners are really early on in their language proficiency. One of the first things that is very useful to learn when learning English as a foreign language is to learn the survival vocabulary. Many years ago, I was going off to teach in Finland. And before going to Finland, I thought maybe I better learn a bit of Swedish, because I was actually going to a Swedish-speaking university in Finland. So I went down to our language learning centre and said, "Have you got any courses in Swedish?" And they said, yes, here we are. And they gave me a set of tapes to learn Swedish. So I sat down and started to work my way through them. It was 3 hours later that I reached the first useful sentence. Everything before that was largely useless to me. It included things like, "This is a bus, the bus is red, it is a red bus," and so on like that. But it wasn't till 3 hours later that I reached the sentence, "Var ligger toaletten?" And "Var ligger toaletten" in Swedish means, "Where is the toilet?" Now you imagine having to wait 3 hours before you can actually ask someone where the toilet is. So I decided that this was crazy. We could design something better than that. So a colleague and I, David Crabb, we worked on creating a survival vocabulary, and that is, what do you need to know if you go to another country for a short time, and you're only going to be there for a couple of weeks, maybe a month at the most? What language do you really need when you are in that situation? And we came up, and what we did, was to go to about 20 different people who'd been in such a situation and say, "What language did you learn?" And then we also asked them, "Tell us a typical day that you spent in that country and the things that you said." And this was a way of cross-checking against what they told us about what they'd learned. And we came up with a list of 120 words and phrases which are really useful. And these are things like greetings and being polite to people, going and buying things and bargaining if bargaining is a typical feature of that country, finding accommodation, finding food and ordering in a restaurant, shopping, dealing with signs in a supermarket and finding things that you need. And these survival vocabulary was classified into 8 different subject groups. It takes about somewhere between 2 and 4 hours to learn these 120 items. You wouldn't learn them all in one go because that would be a very bad application of learning principles. The best way to learn such a vocabulary or list of phrases and words is to do some work on them for 10, 15 minutes, put them away, come back a day later, do some more work on them. And by spreading this work, by spacing the repetition, you can very quickly learn a really useful set of items. I learnt the survival vocabulary for Greek while I was on the aeroplane between Finland and Greece. Now, I was doing mass learning rather than spaced learning, but I'd do a little bit of learning and then have a rest and then do some more and then have a rest and do some more. And by the time the plane landed in Greece, I was able to bargain for a taxi, get to the hotel, go out and buy things at the market, all using my survival vocabulary of Greek. The person sitting next to me on the aeroplane was Greek, and so I had someone who could help me with the pronunciation, who couldn't escape, and so that was a very useful help. That survival vocabulary is available from my website. If you look under Publications 1991, you'll find the English survival vocabulary. And this is really useful for learners to get on top of very early in their language learning. They can practice it during role plays and get really fluent at using these very useful items. And these are items which are really usable. If you happen to be going to another country, such as France or Italy or Japan or Thailand, look on my website and you'll find a translation of the survival vocabulary for about 14 different languages. Try learning it and observe your own learning as you do it. Another kind of early speaking that learners should do should involve classroom language. Where possible, the teacher should be directing learners in the classroom using English, because this provides a very good opportunity for repetition and for meaning-focused input in English. There is a list that you can use of useful classroom words and phrases, but you probably need to adapt the list to your own circumstances. The list involves greetings such as good morning, good afternoon, etc. whenever the class is held. It involves using the course book and can involve phrases like 7 please, close your books. It can involve moving around, such as move into pairs, move into groups of 4, go back to your seats, and so on. So it's very useful for a teacher to think about the kinds of directions and commands that are given in the classroom and encourage the use of English, both by the teacher and by the learners using classroom language. If you use the second language, English, to do this, then you are providing very good opportunities for learning. There is another very useful beginning activity for speaking, and this involves the use of what is called a substitution table. A substitution table involves several columns of words which go together to make correct sentences. Every sentence that you make from a substitution table will be a correct sentence because the table is designed in that way. Here's an example of a substitution table. I'll make a sentence from the table. She did it while we waited outside. Here's another sentence. They repaired it while we had a meal. So you notice that in some columns there's only 1 or 2 items that you can choose, but in other columns there are quite a lot of items. A way to begin using the substitution table is to get the learners just to write a few sentences from the table so they get the idea of making the substitutions. Then when they've got familiar with that idea, you can use this as the basis for speaking. And so the teacher says a sentence from the table and a learner repeats it. And then you can get the learners to orally make sentences from the table. You can go round the class in a fairly regular, predictable way, getting each learner to make a sentence. When the learners get quite good at doing this, then you can get a little bit unpredictable about it, and then start pointing to learners at random, getting them to make a sentence from the table. You can also get the learners to systematically go through the columns in the table. For example, going through the column beginning waited outside. So the first learner might say, she did it while we waited outside. Then the next learner has to say, she did it while we watched. Then the next learner says, she did it while we did our work. And you go through in a predictable way. And then similarly, then the teacher can then start pointing to different parts of the table, if it is shown on the whiteboard, and get the learners to make sentences at what's being pointed at. Substitution tables are ways of providing very controlled speaking practice so that what the learners say is correct. When the learners get good at using a substitution table, they can then start suggesting some of their own substitutions. But this will come quite a bit later. Dictation is a very controlled listening activity. In a dictation, the learners listen to a passage which is around about 100 words long. All of the words in the passage and the grammar in the passage should be familiar to the learners. The teacher reads the text to the learners while they listen. Then the teacher reads the text phrase by phrase, pausing after each phrase so that the learners can write what they hear. You would do it like this. Hey everyone. Then you pause. My name is Emma. And then you pause. And so while the teacher pauses, the learners write. And then you go through the whole text like this. Then you read the whole text again with no breaks so that the learners have a chance to correct their work. Then you need to mark the dictation. And a wise teacher tries to avoid work wherever possible. And a good idea is to see if the learners can do the marking themselves. There are several ways of getting the marking of a dictation done. One way is to use the pyramid procedure. So the learners look at their dictation individually and say, yeah, does it look okay? Are there any places where I didn't really understand? And they might just underline those. Then they work with their partner. They work in pairs. And they compare their dictations and try and decide who's correct and what the correct form should be. When they've done that, then they work in a group of 4 and try and get their dictation correct, and then they finally come to the whole class where they say to the teacher, we think that this is the correct dictation, and the teacher gives them some feedback. Another way to mark a dictation is to have one learner write the dictation on the whiteboard as the teacher dictates. The teacher keeps an eye on what the learner is writing and then makes little corrections to it as they go along. Some teachers call this programmed dictation because the learners listen and they can get immediate feedback by seeing what the other learner writes on the whiteboard and the corrections that the teacher makes to it. Dictation provides very useful feedback for the learners. Dictation is part of the language-focused learning strand because it involves deliberate attention to language. This deliberate attention aims at getting the learners correct in what they listen to. There is a very useful fluency activity which you can use to help learners become fluent at speaking and listening. This is called the 4-3-2 activity. It's called 4-3-2 because the learners choose a very useful subject to talk about. The teacher can either suggest a subject or the learners can think of something that they are very familiar with and want to talk about. Then the learners form pairs. One learner in the pair is learner A and the other is learner B. Learner A will be the speaker and learner B will be the listener. When the teacher says go, the learners who are learner A start talking on the topic to learner B. The topic, for example, might be about pets. And so learner A talks to learner B about pets for 4 minutes. At the end of 4 minutes, the teacher says, stop, change partners, and the learners must stop, and learner B moves to B with a different learner A. As soon as this is done, the teacher says, okay, are you ready? Go. And the same learners, learner A, talks on exactly the same topic without making any serious changes to their new listener. But this time they have only 3 minutes to tell what they are talking about. At the end of 3 minutes, the teacher says, "Stop." The learners change partners, and then they have a chance to talk again to tell the same information for the third time, but this time they only have 2 minutes. So, at the end of the 4-3-2 activity, everybody who is learner A has spoken for 9 minutes, 4 plus 3 plus 2. And everyone who is learner B has listened to 3 different people talk, perhaps on the same topic, perhaps on different topics, but they've listened to 3 different people talk on a topic which could be of interest to them. It's important that learner B doesn't interrupt learner A while the talking is going on, because the purpose of the activity is for learner A to repeat exactly the same talk again so they get more and more fluent at it. Research on the 4-3-2 activity shows that learners' speed of speaking increases during the activity. And this is a very good way of developing listening fluency. So we've looked at a few activities for learners who are beginning to speak and listen in English. The dictation activity is one which the learners can get feedback from to see what they can hear correctly and what they can't hear. The learning of the survival vocabulary and the use of classroom English is a way of providing learners with a small section of the English language that they should get very familiar with through repetition and through practice. Substitution tables provide very controlled practice so that the sentences that learners make are all correct and they gain some understanding of the grammar of the language through the layout of the substitution table.